Hello and welcome to my second lecture on marijuana. In this lecture I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of marijuana. I covered that a lot in the last lecture, but I'll touch upon one big idea at the very end of my discussion of history. Then I'll move on to talk about current marijuana use and some of the acute effects of marijuana on the peripheral and central nervous system. Then to finish up, we'll talk a little bit about the chronic effects of marijuana, and also this gateway hypothesis that we've mentioned in the past lecture. So where we left off with the history of marijuana, a point that I was lingering on towards the end of the last lecture was that marijuana rates have changed, and kind of our attitudes have changed about marijuana quite a bit in the last few decades. It's true to say that attitudes and patterns of use around all drugs have changed, but if you think back to the very first few lectures of the semester where I talked about overall trends in drug use, I think I made the point that trends in use and attitudes around use of marijuana have changed more and have changed more rapidly than have attitudes and patterns of use around most of the other drugs we've talked about. Gallup surveying company has been covering this for quite a few years and have been doing some surveying on people's level of interest in various questions about marijuana. For instance, their support for the legalization of marijuana. And in the last few years, we've seen kind of an inflection where we've gone from the majority of the country being opposed to legalization of marijuana, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, to a majority of the country being opposed or in favor of legalization of the drug. And that's actually shifted a little bit in very recent years, but still a slim majority of people in the country favor legalization of the drug. If we look nationwide, we see a patchwork of different states with different standards about the drug. Most of the states in the country have no laws to legalize marijuana. Some states, for instance Minnesota, allow for medicalized use of marijuana. I'll talk about what that means in just a few more slides. And a few states have legal recreational use of marijuana, including Colorado, of course. But also, of course, remember that from a federal perspective, the drug still is very thoroughly illegal. It's still a Schedule I substance as far as the federal government is concerned. So I mentioned just a second or two ago this idea of medicalization of marijuana. What is that about, or what's the idea here? Well, the basic idea is that advocates of medical marijuana point to the potential benefits or medicinal benefits that marijuana use can have. It's undeniable that for most people, using marijuana will result in a slight increase in appetite. It can also help to suppress vomiting, and it can help to block pain, although not as effectively as opiates. All of these three together make it an attractive drug for doctors to prescribe to people who have long-term problems related to, say, chemotherapy, or related to severe infections of the gastrointestinal system, or who have pain related to injuries but don't need or don't want a pain reliever as strong as an opiate. So some folks argue that marijuana is a useful drug in this respect and ought to be treated as a medicine because it can be helpful for management of side effects and symptoms associated with illnesses. Other folks who argue for changing marijuana laws argue for decriminalizing it, basically removing laws that make the drug illegal to use. Some of this argument hinges upon the costs associated with keeping drugs like marijuana criminalized. Obviously, there are enormous costs that go into law enforcement, paying for policing around marijuana laws, enormous costs associated with incarceration, costs associated with keeping a drug illegal and thus supporting a black market around the drug, and also social costs in the terms of criminalizing people who are either sick and using marijuana for medical purposes, or who may be addicted or dependent upon the drug. Again, folks who argue that marijuana laws should be just simply decriminalized, we should not treat marijuana as an illegal substance anymore, argue that the costs of not changing outweigh the costs of changing. Yeah, this perspective is called harm reduction, and I know your text talks about it a little bit. And it's a broad approach basically to crafting public health policies. And the goal of harm reduction, as the name suggests, is to reduce the amount of bad stuff that happens because of a law or because of a policy, and also to recognize that there are no perfect solutions. By making, if we were to say make marijuana perfectly legal, it would reduce or eliminate some problems, but it may result in other problems. And harm reduction seeks to find a balance that is, as best as possible, tilted in the direction of doing less harm and more good. Harm reduction also highlights the idea that the penalties associated with policies, in this case drug policies, are often more harmful than the drug use itself. That depends a lot on the drug we're talking about, but it could be argued that the way we treat users of marijuana is much more severe than any problems that they cause to themselves or others. And it's also undeniable that the laws we have crafted and the laws that we apply to drugs of all sorts are very unfairly applied. That's especially true with marijuana, and I know earlier on in the semester I highlighted research that was done by the American Civil Liberties Union using National Survey of Drug Use and Health. This is dated to 2010, but there's been more research from this group that basically shows the same pattern, that being that if we compare white people and black people on their rates of use of marijuana, the rates of use in most places at most points in history are about the same. The differences that you see here, at least in most years, are probably not even statistically significant. So, white and black people are using marijuana at about the same rate, but people who are black or African American are far more likely to be arrested for possession of marijuana than people who are white. And that basic unfairness, which ought not to exist, I think most of us would argue, is a problem. It's a social cost that is borne by society, especially by people who are black or other minorities, and that's not right. And we ought to do something to reduce that harm that falls disproportionately on those folks. So again, our attitudes, generally speaking, are changing about marijuana. Some of that change takes the form of arguing that marijuana should be treated as a medicine. That's what, for instance, Minnesota is working with this year. They've recently passed medicalized marijuana laws, and there's actually a dispensary that will be opening up in Moorhead, Minnesota, just across the river from where I sit right now. There are other states that have gone in the direction of decriminalizing the drug, meaning just stopping enforcing laws that exist about the drug, or even fully legalizing the drug. That is to say, repealing laws that exist about the drug. It's a changing pattern. Almost every day there's a good news story about marijuana, and probably if I had a lot more time I would be posting more of those online. I'm sure that you're reading some of them. I hope you're reading them and thinking about them kind of critically and keeping engaged with the class that way. With all that in mind, let's move on now and talk about current use of marijuana. What do we know about the rates of use for this drug? Well, as we always do in this class, let's start with the monitoring the future data set. And here we see, if we're looking at 12th graders and, well, also in 8th and 10th graders, but especially 12th graders in high school, we see kind of fairly common use of the drug, at least if we're asking, what percentage of students have used marijuana at least once within the last year. It's upwards of, almost 40%. And that's, it's gone down a little bit, it's gone up. There's been a slight inflection in the early 2000s, but it's, at least in the last few years, has been hanging kind of steady at just shy of 40%. That's much, much higher than we've seen for all the other drugs, with the exception of alcohol. So if we compare that to opiate analgesics, or we compare that to heroin, or we compare that to cocaine, or we compare that to LSD, these numbers are much, much higher, as is the perceived availability of the drug. You see that maybe 80-90% of high school seniors are saying that marijuana for them is fairly easy or very easy to get. Interestingly, in this data set, we also see a kind of a moderate perceived risk of using the drug, and I'm not exactly sure if moderate is the right word, but again, maybe 40% or so of seniors are saying that there's great risk associated with regularly using using marijuana. So less than half of all high school students, or at least seniors, think that using marijuana regularly is something that's harmful. There still is, interestingly though, fairly high disapproval of regularly using the drug. So 80% of high school students are saying, well, it may not be harmful, but it's at least kind of something you ought not to do, to be regularly using the drug. Now, if we compare rates of use among young people in high school to folks who are a little bit older, especially in the 18 to 25-year-old range, we see much higher rates of use among older folks. So if you're in the 18 to 25-year-old range, you're much more likely, upwards of half or more of all of people from those ages will report having used. And I can appreciate that this graph here on the x-axis doesn't run out to the current 2015, but it gives you a sense of the difference between folks who are slightly older than high school age and folks who are slightly younger. If you're a little bit older, you're much more likely to have tried marijuana at least once in your life. If we look at the National Survey of Drug Use and Health and we ask how many people have used marijuana in at least once in their lifetime, upwards of 44% of folks will have used marijuana at least once in their lifetime. Many of them as recently as within the last 30 days or so. 7-8% of folks within the last 30 days. Those are pretty big numbers, especially as compared to other people, or I'm sorry, as compared to other drugs that we've talked about. So that's the basic take home of those last few slides. Another interesting point to think about is, given that there are so many people who have tried marijuana at least once, what are the patterns we see among folks who've tried marijuana? Is it the case that many people try it once or a few times and then don't go on to regularly using? Or do we see a pattern where most people who try the drug at least once go on to regularly use the drug? Well, again, here the dates I have don't run all the way up to 2015, but they show an interesting pattern. This is monitoring the future data, so again, we're talking about high school kids. But you can see here we've got lifetime prevalence and annual prevalence and 30-day prevalence of drugs. And you can see that across the last few decades, there's been kind of a general rise and fall and rise again in that blue line. The percentage of people, at least high school seniors, who've ever used the drug. The people who've ever once experimented with the drug. There's not been as much of a change if we look on the red lines and the orange line for the 30-day prevalence or the daily use of the drug. So how many folks have been daily users of drugs during that time period? Those rates have stayed fairly low. What this suggests to me, and I think to other people, is that rates of infrequent use of marijuana have changed a lot over time, but rates of frequent use have not. It's relatively rare to be someone who is a regular user of marijuana, meaning a daily user, or even someone who uses marijuana every month. It is more common to be someone who's at least tried marijuana once or twice in your life. And maybe that makes sense, or maybe that fits with the experiences that some of you have had, but I think it probably highlights an important point that there are lots of folks who try marijuana and then just don't go on to using it very frequently. There are very few people, relatively speaking, who use marijuana an awful lot. You're an NDSU student, so you may be wondering, what about marijuana use at NDSU? Well, around here it's the most popular illicit drug or illegal drug, not counting underage drinking. But our use is a little bit less than we see at other universities in our region and in the country. I know these dates only run up to 2010, but I can't find more recent survey data from the core survey on marijuana. I'll have to double check, but I just didn't find it the last time I looked. Bottom line, though, is you can see here that at North Dakota State University, about 1 in 5 people will report having used marijuana within the last year. That's fairly high, but is lower than the aggregate for our state, for North Dakota, and it's a little bit lower than the national average. It's more like 1 in 3 college students will report having used marijuana in the last year. We're more down like 1 in 5. If we ask, what about the last 30 days? Are you a fairly regular user of marijuana, at least in so much as you've used it within the last month? Here, again, our numbers are a little bit lower than the national average. 11%, call it 1 in 10 people if you want to round down a little bit at NDSU have used marijuana within the last month. That's lower, though, than the national average. So again, marijuana is popular here in college, as it is in most colleges. It's the drug that people use the most, not counting alcohol and not counting nicotine as well. But it's not quite as popular out here as it is elsewhere in the country. Okay, so that's a little bit about some recent history and some trends related to marijuana. Let's move on now and talk about the acute effects of marijuana. What goes on in your body, what goes on in your brain when you're using this drug? Well, if we look in the peripheral nervous system, we see a pattern of sympathetic activation. Recall that marijuana does have some stimulant effects, although they're not nearly so strong as the effects of the drugs which we group together as stimulants. So when we look at marijuana, we see increased heart rate, especially early on when people start smoking or otherwise using the drug. There's dilation of blood vessels, which is not always consistent with sympathetic activation, but which certainly happens in the case of marijuana. That accounts in part for that kind of bloodshot eye look that people get when they've been smoking marijuana. And there's also dry mouth. That is more consistent with sympathetic activation. When people have used marijuana, when they've smoked it or otherwise consumed it, they report having cotton mouth or dry mouth as their saliva production decreases for a time. If we move into the central nervous system, we have an interesting picture because marijuana interacts with a class of receptors that until fairly frequently were not well understood or even recognized. We have cannabinoid receptors in our brain and elsewhere in our nervous system. Actually, they're very widely distributed throughout our nervous system, both centrally and peripherally. These are receptors which respond to endogenous chemicals, neurotransmitters that our brain creates, but also respond to THC and the other cannabinoids. And these were relatively recently discovered in history. I'll put up a link to a YouTube clip about the history of the discovery of cannabinoid receptors. It's actually very interesting. One of the substances that activates, one of the naturally occurring brain neurotransmitters that activates cannabinoid receptors is called anandamide. It's an endogenous cannabinoid given the name anandamide because of the Sanskrit word ananda or bliss, the idea that that this neurotransmitter works in systems in the brain which, among other things, involve feelings of pleasure. Which kind of makes sense. When you use marijuana, the cannabinoids that occur in the marijuana interact with those receptor systems that make you feel sort of happy and relaxed, put you in a sort of a blissful state. As I suggested earlier, though, these receptors are located in broadly distributed throughout our nervous system, including areas of the brainstem and the hindbrain, where basic physiological systems operate. Areas of the midbrain and the hindbrain and the midbrain, like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Areas of the forebrain, like the nucleus accumbens, amygdala, hippocampus, other parts of the limbic system. Other parts of the forebrain, including the cortex, especially the frontal cortex. In a way, marijuana has this interesting mix of effects. Recall I mentioned this at the very beginning of my last lecture. It does a lot of different things. It's not a very specific drug in a sense. Well, the reason that is when you use marijuana, you have a group of cannabinoids which are present in your system as a result of that drug, which can now interact with a variety of receptors all throughout your nervous system, producing all sorts of changes. Decreased nausea, increased appetite, decreased coordination, loss of memory functioning, changes in the way emotions operate, changes in complex problem solving, all because of different activation of these different receptor systems. So within the central nervous system, as I've described before, we have these kind of subjective feelings of being either high or stoned, depending on perhaps the type of marijuana that you're using. Those are a result from marijuana cannabinoids interacting with receptors in different parts of your limbic system. We also have impairment of memory, which we see both in terms of forgetfulness, the stereotype of the stoner marijuana user being forgetful, also in terms of fragmented speech. If you've ever talked to someone who's high or stoned on marijuana, they'll sometimes speak in a slow, stuttering way. That's because their working memory is being impaired, and it takes a fair amount of memory to string together words and form coherent sentences. I know this because as I lecture to you guys, I often stumble and trip over myself, although I'm not using marijuana at the moment, or really at all, either before or after my recordings. But it takes a fair bit of work to string together words, and when you're high or you're otherwise affected by marijuana, your working memory is impaired in a slight way, and you have fragmented speech as a result. We also see impairment of systems which govern attention. So people who are on marijuana can be more distractible, can have more difficulty paying attention, sometimes especially to peripheral cues. This is important to note because you occasionally hear people who favor decriminalizing marijuana argue that marijuana is safer than alcohol. In many ways it is, and certainly people can get into all sorts of trouble with alcohol, including, for instance, driving under the influence of alcohol. You can also get into a fair bit of trouble driving under the influence of marijuana, and it's, I think, sometimes, at least among some people, a misconception that that's a relatively safe activity. It's not. It's perhaps not quite so bad as alcohol, but it's certainly by no means a safe activity to do. And indeed, some states actually have now traffic laws where if you're pulled over for bad driving or if you're in an accident, you can be blood tested for levels of cannabinoids and can be charged with driving under the influence of cannabinoids, much as you could with alcohol. Alright, so that's a quick look at the acute effects of marijuana. There's a lot more that we could say, but really the take home I want to give you is that marijuana cannabinoids interact with this kind of relatively new and interesting class of neurotransmitter receptors that we've sort of recently in history discovered, and they interact in diverse ways, producing this really diverse and kind of interesting set of effects throughout your nervous system. Those are the acute effects. Let's go on now and talk about the chronic effects of marijuana. What happens to people who use the drug frequently over long periods of time? Well, we expect with most drugs to see a pattern of tolerance build up. That's not true of every single drug we've talked about, but it's true probably for almost all of them we've talked about. If you use a given dose of drug repeatedly, the effect of that dose will decline over time. And of course this means that sometimes users will increase their dose so as to get the same effect that they originally got from the drug. Things are a little bit weird when we focus on marijuana though, because sometimes when we look at frequent users, we see that they smoke less than new users of the drug. An experienced marijuana smoker may appear to smoke only a few puffs of marijuana joint or cigarette or whatever else, whereas a new user smokes quite a lot. That almost looks like a reverse tolerance effect. And for one, there certainly was a time when people puzzled over this. How is it possible that this drug kind of works in an opposite to what we typically see with patterns of tolerance for other drugs? Well, there are probably a couple explanations for this apparent reverse tolerance effect. One of them is simply that smoking anything, including marijuana, takes practice. Now, some people use marijuana through edible products. You can buy certain medicinal preparations of marijuana that you just absorb through your mouth, but most people who use marijuana are smoking it, and smoking takes practice. Someone who's an experienced smoker is good at drawing large amounts of smoke into his or her lungs, and thus can appear to be smoking less when in fact more smoke is getting into their system, versus a relatively inexperienced smoker who might have to huff and puff to get about the same amount of smoke into his or her body. Another factor that may account for this apparent reverse tolerance effect is that experienced users may choose stronger marijuana. They may have access to, they may seek out marijuana which is more potent or which has stronger effects that they prefer, whether that's a more high feeling or more stoned feeling or some other effect associated with the different cannabinoids in marijuana. So again, an inexperienced user may smoke low-grade marijuana and consequently have to huff and puff and take a lot into his or her body to get the effect that he wants or that she wants. An experienced user may choose a relatively strong form of marijuana and only need to use 1 or 2 puffs. And finally, a factor that may be at play here is that THC is fat soluble. I mentioned in the last lecture it's not particularly liquid soluble, it's highly fat soluble, meaning that once it gets into your body, it fairly easily passes the blood-brain barrier and begins to affect your central nervous system. It also can linger in the fatty tissues of your body and be eliminated fairly slowly over time. That means if you're someone who regularly smokes marijuana, that is, if you smoke maybe every day or every other day, you have a fair bit of residual marijuana, I shouldn't say residual marijuana, residual THC and other cannabinoids lingering in your body. So if you go to get high again or get stoned again, you maybe just have to top off a little bit. whereas an infrequent user or a novice user who doesn't smoke marijuana very much, or maybe has never smoked it before, has little or none of that THC lingering in his body or her body, and has a further distance to go, so to speak, in order to get high or to get stoned. So the bottom line of all this is there is this apparent reverse tolerance effect. It's probably not as mysterious as people initially thought. It probably has to do with certain behavioral patterns that differentiate an experienced smoker from an inexperienced smoker. So that's one thing we see with chronic effects of marijuana. This tolerance process, although this apparent seeming reverse tolerance. Another thing we see with chronic or regular marijuana users is patterns of withdrawal and dependence. People who use marijuana regularly will report withdrawal symptoms when they stop. This is sometimes misunderstood or poorly understood by people. You occasionally will hear people say marijuana is not addictive. That's not true. It's not incredibly addictive. It's not as addictive as nicotine or as alcohol. It's certainly not as addictive as opiates. But if you're a regular user, you're likely going to experience withdrawal when you stop. So if marijuana makes you feel relaxed, you'll likely feel agitated and anxious when you stop using. If marijuana helps you sleep at night or relax at the end of the day, you may feel sleepless or restless when you stop using. That pattern looks a lot like physical dependence, at least to the extent that those unpleasant symptoms may motivate you to go back to using. We also see patterns of psychological dependence among regular users. Those who enjoy the experience of being high or being stoned will tend to seek out that experience, and will have a hard time refraining from doing so if they're trying to quit or trying to cut down. So we do see patterns of withdrawal, we do see patterns of dependence with marijuana users, at least those who regularly use marijuana. Not so common for people who infrequently or very rarely smoke the drug or use the drug. What about health effects? Is it good for your body? Is it bad for your body to use marijuana for long periods of time? The evidence here is pretty clear that there is some cardiovascular risk associated with smoking marijuana, especially if you're a chronic smoker or a regular smoker. You're providing carbon monoxide into your system, which will increase your heart rate and put some stress on your heart. And smoking anything, marijuana included, but not just marijuana, will introduce various carcinogenic substances into your lungs. So to be clear, there are health risks associated with marijuana. They do appear to be more related to the smoking rather than the marijuana itself. Some people who use marijuana regularly will opt to use a vaporizer system, which heats the marijuana to vaporize the cannabinoids without burning the actual plant substance of the marijuana. Less smoke, less risk for lung damage. There are some people who use marijuana regularly who will opt for edible forms of the drug, consuming candies or jellies or butter or whatever else, chocolates that have been laced with marijuana, so as to avoid those respiratory and cardiovascular problems. What about psychological effects of regularly using the drug? Well, it's clear that when someone is actively on marijuana that they have cognitive deficits. We see deficits in short-term and working memory. We see deficits in complex problem solving. For most people, these deficits resolve after time, although it's worth noting that that time may be measured in weeks. If you use marijuana, there's a lingering or a lag period before some of your cognitive abilities are fully back to normal. This may reflect the fact that some of the cannabinoids, such as THC, are lingering in your system longer than you realize. Even after you no longer feel stoned or feel high, you may have impairment of your working memory, for instance, or you may have some impairment of your ability to solve complex problems, or impairment in your ability to sustain attention. To be clear, these are not strong effects, at least not for most people, but it's worth pointing out that they do seem to exist, and they do seem to persist even after the person no longer feels particularly high or particularly stoned. This raises an interesting question, which is, does long-term use of marijuana impair mental abilities? Do these problems, which may appear over short periods of time, during and after you've used marijuana, do they stack up if you're regularly using marijuana? It's tricky to answer this question because, of course, there are all sorts of questions that go along with it, like, well, how long-term does long-term use have to be before we'd expect to see problems? Or is it the case that using marijuana at particular ages is particularly dangerous, or at particular levels of frequency or potency are particularly bad? What about the type of cognitive abilities that we measure? Is it the case that there are particular abilities which are more or less affected by marijuana? It's hard to answer all of these questions, and the science is still somewhat uncertain in this area. However, in recent years, actually just a couple years ago, a fairly famous study was published. I believe it was published in Science. I should look up the reference here and probably link to it. It was called the Dunedin study because it was done in Dunedin, New Zealand. New Zealand's a small country, as you probably know, and because it's a small country and because they have socialized health medicine or healthcare and medicine, they're able to do research there pretty easily, or at least more easily than we can here in America. What this study involved was it involved following a group of about 1,000 people who were born in 1972. Essentially, all the people who were born in that country that year were registered for this study, and almost all of them were followed until their mid to late 30s. Now, during this time, of course, some of those people used marijuana. Most of them probably experimented, well, most, at least about 40 or 50% we'd estimate would experiment with marijuana. Some of them went on to use marijuana regularly. Many of them went on to not use marijuana regularly or much at all. So essentially over time, two groups emerged. Those who were regular users and could be diagnosed as dependent on marijuana, and those who were used marijuana, but not so much so and not so regularly as to be diagnosed as dependent. We might call this a non-experimental study because we're not directly assigning some people to be heavy users of marijuana and some people to be non-heavy users. We might even call it a quasi-experiment or a natural experiment because in a sense, nature provided for us, or provided for the researchers here, one group of people who used marijuana fairly regularly, another group of people who did not. By following these people over time, we could see, do the groups differ in a variety of different measures? So essentially, the researchers looked at different mental abilities, tested at different ages, at age 13, 18, 21, 26, 32, and 38. The folks in the study were interviewed, they submitted to different psychological tests, and the researchers looked to see whether there were differences in terms of overall intelligence, IQ, and in terms of specific cognitive abilities. And some of the findings were really interesting. I remember when this study came out, and it created a lot of buzz among people like me who follow the science of drugs and alcohol. The buzz came out of the finding that there was decreased IQ for people who are regular marijuana users and who'd used over a long period of time. Now, to be clear here, when we're talking about regular marijuana users, we're talking about people who used marijuana on average more than 4 times a week and used it for long periods of time in their life. Among those people, there was decreased intelligence or decreased measured IQ as compared to the people who weren't as heavy users. There was also evidence that people in the group of heavy users were more likely to show deficits in everyday functioning. They're more likely to have memory or attention problems, especially if they were people who began heavy use before the age of 18. This idea of period of vulnerability, perhaps during a time when the brain is still developing. As you probably remember from your biology or psychology class, your brain is still developing well up into your early 20s, and indeed later, but especially during that kind of adolescent period. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that using any drug during that period can present particular challenges for your normal development. Folks who began using heavily at a young age and maintained a pattern of heavy use tended to show deficits in these different areas of measured functioning even after they cut down use later on in time, suggesting perhaps like they had done some damage to themselves because of their early heavy use of the drug. Now, to be clear, this study has been criticized. The people in these two groups differed, of course, in their use of marijuana. One group was a heavy using group, the other group was a not heavy using group. Those groups also differed in terms of other things. They differed in terms of their level of education. They differed in terms of their socioeconomic status within society. And so critics of this study have pointed to these other factors as potential confounds or third variables, which might explain why one group of people basically looked more intelligent and more functional and the other group looked less so. Essentially the argument is, well, maybe it's the fact that the folks who were the heavy users didn't attend as much school, thus they weren't as good at doing psychological tests, which are a lot like school problems, and they looked less intelligent over time. The authors of the study tried to argue back that, well, we tried to statistically control for these variables, and even when we did that, it still looks as if there's this pattern of results or effects. But it's a somewhat contentious study. The science, I think, is pretty persuasive, but it's not without criticism, and that's arguably true of all science. A point to make here as well is when I talk about this study sometimes in class, I can see a kind of a scared look in the eyes of students. Probably those students, many of them, have used marijuana themselves and are now wondering if they've done damage to their brains. The damage, or at least the differences in functioning, let's call it what it is, that were noticed in this group occurred among people who were heavy users of the drug for long periods of time in their life. It seems likely to me, and likely to most people who study this, that if you're in a state of having impaired memory because you're regularly using marijuana and you don't sort of wash out of that because every few days you use again, that could easily affect how well you do in school, how well you do in life. That's a regular heavy user. If you're someone who's rarely used the drug, or maybe only once or twice, we just don't see consistent, or we don't see a pattern of science that suggests that you are likely to suffer from long-term problems associated with the drug. Okay, so that's with that in mind, I'd like to move on and talk about the very last bit of this lecture, and that is the gateway hypothesis. Recall that if we're thinking about how dangerous marijuana is, we might ask, well, is it related to social problems? Is it toxic or dangerous to the body or the mind? And we can also ask, is it something that may increase the risk for other patterns of drug use that may be dangerous in and of themselves? This argument was first put forth by Harry Anslinger from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics back in the 30s. The argument being that, well, if you used marijuana, it might encourage you to use other drugs, and then those drugs could be dangerous to you. And indeed, throughout history, a lot of anti-marijuana campaigns have associated marijuana with other more dangerous drugs, including this somewhat funny poster from the exploitation movie Marijuana, Weed with Roots in Hell. You of course notice here that the people pictured are using some sort of injection drug, perhaps heroin. It's not at all clear that they're using marijuana at all, but the association is there. If you use marijuana, maybe you're more likely to use heroin, and heroin, I think most people would argue, is going to be fairly dangerous for you. Well, it's interesting to note that most people who use marijuana don't use other drugs. Like a slim majority of people, and we're excluding alcohol, of course, because many people use alcohol, and we're also excluding nicotine. But if we think of just about illicit drugs, most people, a majority of people who use marijuana don't use other illicit drugs. So it doesn't seem to be the case that marijuana is opening a door or a gateway to use of other drugs, because if it did, we'd expect to see the majority of people who've used marijuana go on to use other drugs as well. Instead, we see about 20%, and those percentages change year to year. I forget exactly which year this is, but it's fairly recent. It's true to say that most people who've used other illegal drugs like cocaine and heroin and other drugs like that have tried marijuana, and they probably tried marijuana first. But it's also true to say that those same folks also tried alcohol and tobacco probably first. If we look at all people across their lifespan, the typical pattern that we see is that when someone is in their early adolescence, they have access to tobacco and they maybe try smoking cigarettes. Towards their mid to late adolescence or their college years, they have access to alcohol, so they start using alcohol. During that time, they may also start using marijuana. And then some of those folks use other drugs. It's a little bit, I think it's a little bit unfair, to be honest, to pin it on marijuana. Why not alcohol as the gateway? Why not tobacco as the gateway? Again, a lot of people's use of drugs has to do with availability. It also has to do with perceived risk, what drugs people think are relatively dangerous versus what drugs people think are relatively safe. Not to get up on too much of a soapbox here, but we could make this type of gateway argument about a lot of different things. Like we might say riding a bicycle is a gateway to riding a motorcycle, in the sense that most people who ride motorcycles rode a bicycle first. And motorcycles are dangerous, or at least people can get into accidents and hurt themselves, so we might argue, well, perhaps we should make bicycles illegal. I think that misses the point that most people who ride bicycles don't ride motorcycles. They don't go on to use motorcycles, and many people who ride bicycles do so perfectly safely. So without trying to sound too much like I'm arguing a political point here, I'd like to just gently assert that the gateway hypothesis is now understood to be pretty invalid or flawed in terms of an argument. Nonetheless, you still hear it from time to time. It surprises me every few months or every year or so. I'll read about a debate about marijuana laws, or I'll read a blog post, or I'll talk to someone and they'll say, yes, but doesn't marijuana make it more likely that you'll use other drugs? The answer is generally speaking no. It doesn't appear to be the case that there's something intrinsic about marijuana use that makes it a pathway or a gateway to the use of other drugs. That is to say, if we try and understand the biology of the drug marijuana, it doesn't seem to work on the brain in a way that predisposes the brain to be more likely to use other drugs. If we look at the pattern of drug use for most people who ever use marijuana, it's just not the case that most people go on to use other illegal drugs. They do, of course, use drugs like alcohol and in some cases tobacco, but many of those same folks were using those drugs before they initiated marijuana use. So again, this intrinsic or kind of gateway argument seems to have very little empirical support, at least when we try to look across most people who use the drug marijuana. What's offered kind of as an alternative argument is the sociocultural argument. This is that maybe for some people marijuana use indirectly increases the risk of use of other drugs because it is associated with particular subcultures of folks who may use other drugs as well. That is to say, if you, as a young person, begin using marijuana, it may put you into contact with people who not only use marijuana, but also use other drugs, and thus you may have access to other drugs. Or you may tend to be generally resistant to the norms or the rules of society, and you may feel emboldened to use other drugs as a form of rebellion or as a form of protest. Now, to be clear, this type of argument doesn't make sense for most people who use marijuana, but it may for some folks. And the basic thesis of both of these is, again, there doesn't seem to be a particularly strong pathway from marijuana to other drugs, as was originally imagined in the so-called gateway hypothesis or gateway argument. There may be a more indirect pathway to using other illegal drugs for some people, and if that exists, it's likely to do with the sociocultural factors that accompany marijuana use for some folks. This is still in roughly 50 states, 50% of the states, I should say, an illegal drug. So to gain access to it, you may need to begin doing illegal things, associating with people who are breaking the law, at least breaking the laws around marijuana use. This may, for some folks, lead to increased risk for breaking other laws, including laws about using other illegal drugs. That's probably not the case for most folks who use marijuana, but maybe for some people. Well, I hope that all makes sense. This is another kind of long and I hope sort of interesting lecture. As I always say, thanks for your attention. Take a while to sit back and think about some of this material. Hopefully it'll make sense to you. If it doesn't, or if you have questions, please ask them in class or post them in the discussion boards on Blackboard or post them in the comments section on YouTube. I'll do my best to respond to them as I hope I always do. So again, thanks so much for your attention. Bye-bye.